So it's the heart's job to pump blood through the body. If we go back to the cell and look at the cell structure here, we can see that the cells are connected by these intercalated discs. And these intercalated discs allow for the rapid passage of signals from one cell to the next. So if we talk about the cardiac conduction system, our heartbeat is initiated in this sinoatrial node. Now in the sinoatrial node, this will fire regardless of any external stimulation. So for our entire life, this thing will self-generate a pulse. When it fails to do so, that's when we would need to have a pacemaker put in, like an artificial pacemaker, but this is the pacemaker of the heart. And it's going to fire slow and steady no matter what. Now we do have some nerve input here where certain neurotransmitters can increase the rate of fire or decrease the rate of fire of the sinoatrial node, but this is going to fire regardless of external stimulation. This initiates a signal that's going to be transmitted through the atria, and this happens pretty fast. So the signal goes through both atria, and that signal triggers the contraction of the cardiac muscle in those areas. So the top part of the heart is going to start to contract as soon as the electrical signal passes through. If you've ever seen an EKG diagram, it looks something like this. This is the P wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave. Formation of the P wave happens when the sinoatrial node fires and the signal starts to pass through the atria, leading to atrial systole or atrial contraction. Now the signal is eventually going to get to the next stop along the way, the atrioventricular node. At the AV node, there's a 0.1 second pause to allow for the completion of the contraction of the atria. That happens between the P to Q interval. Then the AV node is going to fire. And when the AV node fires, a signal is transmitted down the interventricular septum into these Purkinje fibers that will lead to the ventricle walls. That's going to form the QRS complex. Our atria will start to relax, so we'll have atrial diastole. And our ventricles are going to start to contract. So we have ventricular systole. Now we don't see atrial diastole necessarily on this EKG because the ventricular systole has such large of electrical conduction that this is usually picked up, and that's represented by the QRS complex. And then eventually the ventricles will start to relax, and that's what forms the T wave. You'll have ventricular diastole. And here you can see a flow chart of the cardiac conduction system. So some people like to see diagrams like this more than looking at it on the actual heart. So this is kind of the flow of the electrical activity. So all of those heart cells that I showed you a picture of in the first part of this section, they all need to be fed. They all need a rich source of nutrients in order to generate energy to allow for the contraction of the cardiac muscle tissue. They're fed by their own blood supply, and that blood supply is called coronary circulation. The coronary arteries, or the myocardial cells, receive blood from the right and left coronary arteries. The first branches come off of the aorta, and then the ventricles receive blood from the branches of both the right and left coronary arteries. So here you can see the aorta and how these coronary arteries come off of the aorta. And this goes through all of the branches of these coronary arteries. For this class, you don't need to know the names of all of these different coronary arteries. You just need to know that the arteries on the surface of the heart that feed the heart muscle tissue are known as coronary arteries. And the coronary veins are going to follow a very similar path. So they're going to drain the blood from those regions of the heart. As a rule, the veins follow a course that closely parallels that of the coronary arteries. After going through the cardiac veins, blood enters the coronary sinus to drain into the right atrium. Several veins drain directly into the right atrium. So one of the major homeostatic imbalances that we're going to kind of work up to is congestive heart failure, so when our heart kind of fails to function properly. And this is kind of a positive feedback mechanism that builds and builds and builds to eventually have a disease state. We start with coronary atherosclerosis. So poor lifestyle choices and sometimes even genetics, like in the case of familial hypercholesterolemia, but even other types of genetics can cause this, leads to the accumulation of plaques in arteries or the blood vessels around the body. Coronary atherosclerosis is specifically the accumulation of plaques on the insides of the coronary arteries. So imagine we have a blood vessel, and blood freely flows through the center of this blood vessel. With coronary atherosclerosis, we have plaques that start to accumulate on the inside of the walls, and this is going to narrow the opening. So it kind of restricts blood flow through the area. That leads to ischemia. Ischemia is a constriction of blood flow. When you have a constriction of blood flow, especially to heart muscle tissue, that leads to angina pectoris, which is chest pain. Eventually, these coronary arteries can become completely blocked. And when they do become completely blocked, over years and years of narrowing, that is called an infarction. So an infarction is a general term for any type of blockage. You can have an infarcted intestine, which means it's completely blocked intestine. But a myocardial infarction is talking about blockage of a coronary artery. Myocardial infarction is a heart attack. So let's look at this heart diagram one more time and talk a little bit more about what a heart attack is. So if we have a blockage, I'll blow this up a little bit. So if we have a blockage here, anything distal to the blockage is going to suffocate. So all of this tissue here would lose its blood supply, and all of this would suffocate and die. And that's what happens during a heart attack. A portion of your heart suffocates and dies. Now when this happens, your heart is going to recover and it's going to repair itself. But you can't regrow new heart muscle tissue. You can only regrow scar tissue. So that's what we call fibrosis. So fibrosis is talking about replacing heart muscle tissue with scar tissue. So why is it that some people can have one heart attack and live, while other people, multiple heart attacks and live, while other people have one heart attack and die? It really depends on the location of the blockage. If you block at a region that's pretty distal, a small portion of the heart muscle tissue will be damaged. But let's say we have a blockage way up here. If we block here, that means this much of the heart is damaged. And usually people can't recover from something like that. So it's really dependent on the area of blockage. If you blow a coronary, usually that's talking about blowing out a blood vessel, one of these coronary arteries. And if we have a total coronary, we can block there or blow those out. And that means that the entire heart then dies at that point. Even years after a heart attack, this region that grew back as fibrosis or connective tissue, scar tissue, is a weak area. So over years and years of using the heart, this is a weak spot in the heart. And suddenly, this can rupture and it can actually burst open inside of the chest of a patient well after a heart attack has occurred. So that's something that is kind of scary when it comes to heart attacks. So congestive heart failure or left ventricular heart disease. When your heart slows down, fluids tend to leak out of the cardiovascular system a little bit more. Why would your heart randomly start slowing down? Well, if you had a heart attack and part of your heart muscle tissue grew back as connective tissue, that's now dead weight that's on the surface of the heart. So it's more difficult for the heart to keep beating. And as we continue to beat, that fibrous connective tissue is going to continue to be that dead weight. Now let's say we have another heart attack. Well, that's another part of dead weight that we're going to have on the surface of the heart. The heart rate is going to slow, and the heart's going to be working a lot faster to move blood around in the body. When we slow down the heart rate, fluid is going to start leaking out of the bloodstream, and that fluid can accumulate in the tissues as well as around the chest. That's why it's known as congestive heart failure, because we're literally filling up our tissues and our chest cavity with fluid that's been leaking out of the bloodstream. Over a period of time, eventually the heart can't keep up with our body's need for oxygen, and people end up dying of congestive heart failure.